Concepts, Values and Wise Advice from the Billy Meier Context compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Stress.
Contact Report 849.
Unfortunately, overstraining of any kind is a particularly widespread problem that human beings are no longer able to cope with in the short term or even permanently. They are always entrusted with more major or minor tasks that they are no longer able to cope with. But what is excessive demand? This is based on a condition when the abilities, capacities, possibilities, and resources of a human being are no longer sufficient to master their situations in life and everyday life. As a result, problem-solving or overcoming a challenge becomes a factor that can no longer be managed. When human beings are overtaxed, they reach their limits and become incapable of providing the necessary services, whether these are cognitive, psychological, or also physical in nature, that is to say, overtaxing. The symptom of overstrain is overload, which can have similar meanings depending on the context, and which also creates psychological pressure, especially when goals are unattainable or expectations are set too high. Overload brings with it the feeling of having to accomplish more than life's energy and strength can provide. If the human being feels overtaxed, this is associated with a high degree of stress, which reacts immediately in the form of distress, which corresponds to negative stress, or in the form of eustress, which can be regarded as positive stress. Distress occurs as a great burden that brings with it the feeling and thoughts of not being able to cope with challenges that cannot be overcome despite the greatest effort. There is also simply a lack of the necessary time or skills. Negative stress is usually characterized by the attitude, "I can't do it anyway," because it is precisely this feeling and thought that creates the feeling of being overwhelmed and helpless. In contrast, eustress, positive or healthful stress, is motivating, which spurs the human being on to particularly good and valuable achievements. Consequently, they increase their attention and performance. They are intensively occupied and constantly have a lot to do. Consequently, they perceive the whole thing as pleasant and progressive, so they fly high during positive stress. Thus, not all stress is the same, so on the one hand, it can be equated with negative excessive demands, but also with positive high performance. Thus, stress can be good and helpful when the human being feels a little stressed, which means that some human beings only achieve their best performance when they feel stressed. Stress only becomes harmful when it leads to emotional overload, that is, when short-term eustress turns into sustained and negative distress. Overstrain is often ignored by human beings, especially when they convince themselves that it is all just a short-lived feeling of sluggishness, and the like, and do not want to admit to themselves that there is overstrain, and that the real reason is that expectations and challenges cannot be corresponded to. The fact that it is actually a weakness in the form of an excessive demand does not want to be acknowledged, which makes the problem even worse. In order to be able to really react correctly to an acute or threatening overload, human beings are urged to pay attention to the symptoms, which are very often signs of overload and mainly the following: exhaustion, listlessness, inertness, tiredness, and frustration. There is an increasing feeling of being under pressure. Making mistakes increases, although efforts are made to the contrary. The limits of performance become smaller and smaller. The private life begins to suffer increasingly. Emergence of anxiety regarding new tasks. Grumpy reactions to everything and anything. Very often, excessive demands do not arise for no reason, and there is not always just one trigger, because often the cause is an interplay of several factors, such as tasks that pile up more and more, which means that there are more and more burdens that are supposed to be done, but which one can no longer cope with. The great time pressure, which is constantly growing, creates problems that quickly become the cause of excessive demands and no longer make it possible to switch off. The remaining energy reserves can no longer be replenished. Overstrain is also often a question of attitude, which is decisive for how the human being perceives and evaluates the situations and challenges that arise. If they are self-confident and assume that the difficulties that arise can be overcome, then they are not overtaxed, but make a conscious effort to overcome everything. If, on the other hand, he or she harbors helpless thoughts and acts accordingly, then the human being's attitude contributes to overburdening and overtaxing. In this case, they do not make life easy for themselves and do not admit to themselves that they are failing and that they are creating the cause for the overload because they lack self-competence. As a result, the human being does not have the ability that his or her position needs and requires, because they have not developed sufficiently to be able to meet the demands of their position. For the human beings affected by excessive demands, everything has a great failing effect on the state of the psyche, whereby it must be explained that the so-called psyche does not exist and is not an organ of the body, but a forming and constantly changing state of feeling. For example, feeling good, feeling open-minded, feeling down, feeling bad, feeling agitated, feeling psychologically ill, etc., which results from the thoughts, feelings, demeanor, character traits and behaviors, etc. Often self-doubt arises in the human being, whereby he or she then wonders whether they are good or bad as a human being, whereby, however, the human beings around them often equally have some kind of problems, but face these indifferently and simply do not let anything show, and consequently it is assumed that similar challenges are apparently easily dealt with. This is despite the fact that frequent fears of failure and of the future create depressive states just as much as those who succumb to any kind of excessive demands, which in reality occur much more frequently in human beings than is assumed and apparent. Overstrain is indeed not uncommon, and is therefore not an individual fate, because the longer, the more human beings fall prey to the delusion that they cannot hold out and be soft. Every 26th human being even plays sick, or simply freaks out in order to no longer have to fulfill expectations as valuable human beings. In other words, that a large part of humanity is overtaxed to live up to life and society, as well as their health in every respect and in all the important demands.